Joining us now to talk about South African online services competing in the global digital space is Charles de Wet. He's the head of indirect taxes at PwC. Charles, thanks for your time. I think firstly, just give us the lay of the land. I'm reading a note here and it says South Africa's online industry is under significant pressure and it is battling to compete with the global giants. So how do we compare?
What you need to take into account in these circumstances is because it's in the digital space and online, that foreign suppliers can come in and sell services to South Africans without investing a significant amount of money into South Africa or putting any infrastructure on the ground. That means that they directly compete with local suppliers of similar services, and the local suppliers are always subject to South African tax. They need to charge VAT at the rate of 14% on those amounts, and they pay tax on their profits at the rate of 28%. And if you look at the global players, because at this stage there are quite limited rules associated with bringing them into the South African net, very often they don't need to charge VAT on those amounts. Or on the amounts charged to South African consumers, and also they could be located in a jurisdiction where in fact they don't pay a significant amount of income tax at all, and that is having a negative impact on the industry in South Africa, and something that needs to be addressed by changing the tax system so that it becomes more relevant in this particular space.
Hi, Charles. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, to actually change the South African tax system, I mean, you obviously identified this problem. What sort of timeline do you actually look at? I mean, how long will these international, product providers actually, have the advantage of our local players?
The problem with any amendment to the tax legislation is it takes time to get it through the process. What we did see was that last year, with effect from the 1st of June, by way of regulation, the Minister of Finance introduced certain rules that did bring foreign players into the South African VAT net, and that meant that suppliers of e-books, for example, of subscription services, were in fact under an obligation to come and register in South Africa and charge VAT on those amounts. A number of the big players in that particular space have in fact done that and are compliant. The issue is that currently that list is quite restrictive. One needs to look within the context of the VAT legislation and see to what extent that can be broadened to include other services. Now, the way that it was done last year was it was specifically done by way of regulation. The Value-Added Tax Act was amended to make provision for that, so the Minister of Finance can effectively, at a relatively short notice, amend that regulation and bring further services into the Act. In respect of other taxes, though, there's a much longer process as far as that's concerned to try and bring the foreign players into the Income Tax Act. Would require amendments to the Income Tax Act. There's a long process associated with that. The draft's only published in July, and the law only comes into effect in January or February of the following year, and it has to go to the Portfolio Committee of Finance in between. I think the issue, though, as far as that's concerned, is that this is something that the OECD is grappling with in terms of saying what is reasonable in these circumstances, and the tax system was very much designed where there was physical movement of goods, and to get into the digital space, there's a certain amount of change and innovation that needs to happen, and nobody really knows exactly what those answers are at the moment. So we first need to get to a solution, being led by the OECD at that particular point in time, and then the legislation in South Africa needs to be amended to implement those particular rules.
Charles, tell us about the economic impacts. I mean, obviously you're talking about the pricing differential and how this impacts local market players. So tell us about the economic impact this has had, the fact that we aren't able to compete globally.
If you look at certain types of services, typically a local supplier would be required to add VAT at the rate of 14% of top of the amount that they charge for a particular supply of a service, whereas if there's no obligation then the foreign supplier, because they don't need to be registered, because they're not in scope in terms of the legislation, could effectively charge 14% less. So, if you look at a particular service, if a South African supplier is going to deliver it to you, then it would cost you 114 Rand, whereas potentially if it's a foreign supplier, it would only cost you 100 Rand. So there is a pricing differential. I mean, I think that what often happens in this space is the moment that you link to a particular type of technology, you're unlikely to change that, and that, I mean, gives the opportunity for the foreign service providers to build market share kind of with a tax advantage against the local service providers. The other impact that one also needs to take into account is obviously if no VAT is being charged, then there's no contribution to the South African economy. There's no tax take as far as that's concerned. So while the consumer is being advantaged in the process, there's no tax that is being collected on that particular transaction. What we have seen globally is that typically the foreign providers of these services include VAT in the price that they already charge. So realistically, they don't specifically increase their price to do that. So at least it is affecting their margin, but tax is being collected in the process. The moment that the law has been amended or the regulation has been introduced to make them subject to VAT in South Africa.
Charles, thank you so much for that update. That was Charles de Wet. He's the head of indirect taxes at PwC Africa.